Good evening, fellow adventurers. How are you today? I hope you're doing well and ready to journey through time together with Nightly Historian. The night before the invasion smelled of salt and steel. Across the English Channel, thousands of ships waited in total darkness, engines humming beneath the waves like a restless heartbeat. Soldiers lay awake, listening to the wind and imagining what dawn might bring. Some whispered prayers. Some tried to sleep. Most simply stared into the night, knowing history was only hours away. Far from the water, far from the soldiers who would soon face fire and fear, another battle was already being won in silence. It was a battle not of force, but of imagination, fought with letters, radio transmissions, and a man's absolute dedication to a lie so perfect, so convincing, that it reshaped the destiny of nations before the first Allied soldier touched French sand. This is the story of Juan Pujol Garcia, the man MI5 would come to call GARBO, a man who fought tyranny not with bullets, but with words. A quiet, stubborn, endlessly creative man who built an entire army out of thin air and made some of the most powerful military planners in Europe believe every word of it. To understand how a single individual altered the course of the war, we begin far from the beaches of Normandy, in a country fractured by its own civil war, Spain. Juan Pujol was born into a comfortable middle-class family in Barcelona. He did not grow up dreaming of espionage or secret missions. He dreamed only of living in a peaceful world, far away from cruelty and oppression. But life had different plans for him. As Spain descended into civil conflict during the 1930s, Pujol saw firsthand how fragile freedom could be. He witnessed cruelty from multiple factions, and he emerged from the chaos with one unshakable conviction. He despised totalitarianism in all its forms. He would later say that the war in Spain taught him the value of human dignity, and that he felt an obligation to defend it wherever he could. When the Second World War erupted across Europe, Pujol watched with rising frustration. Britain and the Allied powers were fighting for the survival of democratic civilization. He wanted to help them, yet he had no skills, no intelligence background, no reason to be trusted. He walked away discouraged, but not defeated. If the British would not let him help them, perhaps he could find another way. And so began one of the most astonishing journeys in the history of espionage. Unable to join the Allies officially, Pujol chose a path that defied logic. He decided to infiltrate the Axis intelligence service on his own terms, with no training and no supervision, in order to sabotage them from within. It was madness. It was genius. It was the beginning of GARBO. He approached the German embassy in Madrid with an entirely fabricated backstory, claiming to be a loyal supporter of their regime and eager to serve as a spy in Britain. The intelligence officers there, constantly searching for new assets, found his eagerness suspicious, yet oddly compelling. War often bends the rules of judgment, and they eventually gave him a chance. Pujol walked out of the embassy with a codename, a cipher, and a mission he never intended to accomplish. His assignment was to infiltrate England, gather intelligence, and report military movements. But instead of traveling to Britain, Pujol bought a tourist guidebook, a handful of English newspapers, and a map. He used these simple tools to fabricate entire letters of intelligence that he sent back to the German handlers. He wrote detailed descriptions of Liverpool shipyards, British morale, troop deployments,
all stitched together from maps, imagination, and bits of news he gathered from public sources. But what made his early reports so believable was not their accuracy, but their imperfections. Pujol understood something fundamental about effective deception. Truth must be mixed with believable error. He invented fictional informants, dock workers, soldiers, airmen, each with names, personalities, habits, and flaws. He created a sprawling spy network that existed only in his head, yet Berlin believed in it completely. His reports were long, emotional, and crafted with the tone of a man genuinely afraid of being caught. German intelligence officers began to value him highly, praising the quality of his network and rewarding him with increasing trust.
Still, Pujol knew he could not maintain this deception forever without support. He continued trying to contact the British, sending messages, requesting meetings, insisting that he had something valuable to offer them, but his attempts were ignored or dismissed. Meanwhile, his reports grew more elaborate. He described entire ship convoys moving through British ports, convoys that never existed. He created stories of soldiers complaining about food shortages, aircraft divisions training in Scotland, and political debates inside Parliament. All of it fiction, yet all of it consumed eagerly by German military planners. Eventually, by late 1941, British intelligence became aware of a peculiar phenomenon. German military messages contained information that clearly originated from a spy who did not exist in Britain. They traced the source back to Madrid, to an untrained volunteer with a knack for making fiction look real. MI5 contacted him at last. And when Juan Pujol Garcia stepped onto British soil for the first time, he was no longer a nobody. He was GARBO, the greatest actor the war had never seen. London assigned him a desk, a radio operator, and 2 case officers. They brought him into the heart of MI5's deception unit. Pujol, working with the full machinery of British intelligence behind him, began expanding his imaginary network. This was the moment when the lies of a single man would become a critical weapon in the Allied arsenal.
When Pujol entered MI5 headquarters for the first time, he walked not into a world of spies, but into a labyrinth of paperwork, suspicion, and cigarette smoke. Intelligence work, he quickly learned, was less about cloak-and-dagger theatrics and more about decoding the human mind, understanding motive, and shaping perception. And Pujol, to everyone's surprise, possessed a natural instinct for all 3. The officers in charge of deception read through the letters he had sent to the German intelligence service. They expected to find the work of an amateur. Instead, they found a masterpiece. Carefully balanced details, believable errors, emotional undertones, and patterns that mirrored how real informants behaved. One senior officer whispered to another, "He fooled Berlin without us. Imagine what he can do with us." And so, they decided to take a chance. The MI5 handlers assigned to Pujol were Thomas Harris and Cyril Kalkahorn. Harris was artistic, fluent in Spanish, and had a sympathy for unconventional minds. Kalkahorn was structured, methodical, and calm. Together they formed the perfect balance, creativity and discipline, bound together by a common mission. They gave Juan a new code name, GARBO. The name was a tribute to Greta Garbo, the legendary actress, because Juan was, in essence, performing the greatest role of his life. The name stuck immediately, and everyone in MI5 quickly adopted it. With a safe house, a radio operator, and full access to British military movements, Pujol now had everything he needed to weave illusions at a scale he had never attempted before. His imaginary spy network, once 6 or 7 fictional individuals, exploded into dozens. He wrote biographies for them, detailed personal quirks, financial problems, romantic struggles, petty disagreements, children, pets. He breathed life into shadows. The German handlers, unaware that their star agent had never even visited a British port, began praising his network as one of the most reliable in their entire intelligence system. They sent him money for his informants, salaries, bribes, and operative costs. MI5 quietly absorbed the funds and wrote receipts on behalf of people who weren't real. As weeks turned into months, GARBO grew bolder. He submitted reports about troop movements in Scotland, training camps in Wales, and political opinions inside London. He fabricated shipping delays, naval shortages, and internal arguments within British command, knowing full well that Germany's intelligence service found chaos in enemy ranks comforting. But deception is more complex than simply inventing believable lies. Pujol understood something deeper, the human desire to believe. He exploited that desire with remarkable precision. If Berlin wanted to hear that Britain was unprepared, he told them Britain was unprepared. If they wanted to hear that morale was weakening, he wrote letters filled with stories of discouraged soldiers and exhausted commanders. Every report was not just a story, it was a psychological gift crafted for the listener. Yet the more successful he became, the more dangerous the work grew. Deception is a fragile web. One inconsistency, one missed detail, one report that contradicted reality, and everything could collapse. GARBO worked obsessively, often late into the night, reviewing past letters, checking timelines, cross-referencing names that had never existed. Harris often found him hunched over a desk, surrounded by papers, scribbling notes on troop positions and supply chains as if they were real. "You are creating a country inside your mind," Harris once said quietly. Pujol smiled. "A country they choose to believe in." MI5 realized that they did not just have a spy, they had an artist. As the war intensified across Europe, British High Command began preparing for something unprecedented, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The success of this invasion depended on secrecy, not just keeping the real landing location hidden, but convincing the enemy to look in the wrong direction entirely. This was the beginning of Operation Fortitude, the master deception that would support the D-Day landings. It required actors, inflatable tanks, forged documents, misinformation campaigns, and the most credible double agents in Europe. At the center of it all was GARBO.
His reports became the backbone of the operation. Every line he sent was carefully designed to reinforce a single illusion: that the Allied invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. He built an imaginary army group, the first U.S. Army group, commanded by General George Patton. He described supply movements, training exercises, new airfields, and divisions massing in southeastern England. None of it existed. But the Berlin leadership believed every word. They requested more detail. GARBO provided it. They asked for aerial reconnaissance. British forces showed them inflatable tanks and wooden airplanes positioned exactly where GARBO claimed real ones were. They demanded confirmation from other spies. MI5 let German agents transmit small fragments of information that subtly reinforced GARBO's narrative. This collaboration between GARBO and the broader deception machine was seamless. It was as though the entire operation moved to the rhythm of one imagination: his. Yet deception, even perfect deception, takes a toll. Pujol's days were filled with transmissions and drafts. His nights were often restless. Maintaining nearly 30 fictional informants was a psychological burden few could imagine. Each time Berlin wrote back with praise, promotions, or requests, He felt a weight pressing on his conscience. He often wondered if his lies would one day cost innocent lives. But MI5 reminded him gently and repeatedly that deception was the difference between a catastrophic invasion and a successful one. Lives would be lost regardless. His lies would help reduce the number. Pujol accepted the logic, but the emotional burden remained. Still, he pressed forward. The war demanded it. The invasion demanded it. And history would later show that no single liar in the war was more essential than GARBO.
Operation Fortitude was unlike anything the world had seen. It was not a battle of tanks or ships, but a battle of perceptions, fought in the shadows between what the enemy feared and what they expected. The Allied command understood that even the strongest army could be weakened by a well-placed illusion, and GARBO was the illusionist at the center of it all. In a quiet office in London, Pujol sat beside his assigned radio operator as they transmitted messages across Europe. Each message had to be crafted with precision. Too vague, and Berlin would grow suspicious. Too detailed, and the lie would collapse under its own weight. He wrote slowly, thoughtfully, placing each sentence like bricks in a fortress. He described the buildup of a massive assault force in southeast England, soldiers training relentlessly, supply trucks lining the roads, aircraft filling the skies above Kent. The reality, however, was that these divisions did not exist. Some were entirely fictional. Others were stationed hundreds of miles away. MI5 helped bring his illusions to life. Inflatable tanks were rolled onto fields. Wooden aircraft were arranged on runways. Fake radio chatter filled the airwaves. Troops marched in patterns designed to fool reconnaissance. From the sky to enemy analysts, it all looked unmistakably real. GARBO's greatest strength was not just deception, it was consistency. Every report he sent aligned perfectly with the broader illusion, each lie reinforcing the last, until the entire narrative felt inevitable. In the cold logic of enemy intelligence rooms, the picture was clear. The Allies were preparing to strike at Pas-de-Calais. But Pujol knew the truth, that the real invasion would happen at Normandy. And the closer the date came, the heavier the responsibility felt. To mislead an entire military machine was one thing. To mislead it at the precise moment lives depended on it was something else entirely. GARBO maintained his fictional network with increasing complexity. One of his agents reported tension in military camps near Dover. Another described overcrowded supply depots. Yet another claimed to have overheard British officers discussing a secret meeting with General Patton. Each detail, fabricated or exaggerated, became a thread weaving the tapestry of deception. The German High Command increasingly relied on his intelligence. His reports were forwarded to top-level generals. They were read aloud in strategy meetings. Commanders adjusted troop positions based on information that came directly from GARBO's imagination.
As the pressure intensified, MI5 kept a close eye on him. They feared burnout, miscalculations, or small errors that could expose the entire deception. But Pujol worked with a kind of quiet fervor. He believed deeply in the cause. To him, each lie was a shield protecting thousands of Allied soldiers who would soon step onto the beaches of France. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows of his London office, Harris leaned over and asked him softly, "Do you ever fear they will discover the truth?" Pujol exhaled slowly. "Every day," he whispered. "But fear is part of the work, no? A spy without fear is not a spy." The closer June came, the more tense the atmosphere grew. Allied commanders argued over timing. Weather forecasters debated storm fronts. Soldiers drilled through nights and fog. And inside a dim room in London, Garbo crafted the final act of his deception, one that would determine the fate of the coming invasion. He began sending messages suggesting that British leadership was holding back its strongest divisions for a later, larger strike, the real invasion, which would follow the anticipated assault at Normandy. He reinforced the idea that Normandy, if they happened at all, would merely be a distraction, a feint designed to draw enemy forces away from Pas-de-Calais. The brilliance of his plan was its simplicity. He didn't need to convince the enemy that Normandy was a trick. He needed to convince them that Normandy was not worth reacting to. The enemy leadership, already biased towards expecting an attack at Calais, eagerly accepted his version of events. Garbo had found not only the perfect lie, but the perfect audience. Meanwhile, MI5 and Allied planners were staging the largest deception infrastructure ever assembled. Operation Fortitude South, which focused on reinforcing the illusion of a Calais invasion, was integrated with Garbo's messages. Together, they formed a symphony of misinformation.
Fake radio networks crackled with communications between phantom divisions. Inflatable tanks shimmered under the summer sun. Entire camps lit their lanterns each night, only to extinguish them before dawn as decoy soldiers marched in choreographed patterns. When aerial photos were captured, enemy analysts circled tents, trucks, and supply stacks with growing certainty. The deception was complete. All that remained was to maintain the illusion for as long as necessary. The pressure on Garbo became immense. Each message he sent was reviewed by senior intelligence officers. Each sentence carried responsibility. He had to speak to enemy expectations without sounding too eager. He had to mirror their thinking while guiding it. He had to mislead them without revealing his intent. His fictional network, now nearly 30 characters, had become a living organism inside his mind. He tracked each agent's personality, motivations, fears, and limitations. He wrote about their illnesses, their frustrations, their changing circumstances. They were more real to him than the people in his own apartment building. As he leaned over his writing desk late into the night, he often wondered what would happen if the enemy discovered they were being manipulated by ghosts. The thought haunted him, not because he feared punishment, but because the entire invasion relied on the illusion holding firm. Every sound outside startled him. Every radio crackle carried weight. Every letter he drafted could shape the course of the war. And yet he continued, calm, methodical, driven by the belief that deception, if used with purpose, could save more lives than any weapon ever forged. The night before D-Day began like a slow, trembling breath across the coast of southern England. The sea grew restless under low clouds, and the wind rolled through the dark water with a chilling warning. Storms had battered the channel for days, delaying the invasion and fraying already fragile nerves. Yet beneath that turbulence, a sense of finality hung in the air, a quiet understanding that history had chosen this moment, this night. Across the hidden ports of England, ships were lined up in eerie silence. Soldiers climbed aboard landing crafts with somber faces, their boots splashing in the shallow water. Officers whispered instructions under the dim light of covered lanterns. Every man knew that when the sun rose, the world would change forever. Whether for better or worse, no one could say. In a cramped MI5 office in London, far from the waves, far from the smell of fuel and salt, Garbo sat at his desk with a pencil in hand. He was exhausted, his eyes red from endless days of drafting messages, but he knew he had one last task before the invasion, to send the most critical broadcast of his life. The deception had to continue, but it had to be done carefully. The enemy needed to be informed of the invasion, but the timing had to be perfect. Too early, and reinforcements might be sent to Normandy. Too late, and the message would lose its credibility. It was a razor's edge, a delicate dance between truth and manipulation. Pujol leaned back in his chair, listening to the steady hum of the radio equipment beside him. The air smelled of dust and warm circuits. His radio operator glanced at him with a mixture of fatigue and anticipation. They both understood the stakes. They both knew that within hours, the greatest amphibious assault in history would begin. MI5 officers hovered nearby, watching the room with quiet intensity. Their faces reflected the gravity of the moment. They were men accustomed to intelligence work, but this felt different. Everything they had done, everything they had planned, depended now on the illusion holding firm. To GARBO, the weight felt heavier than ever. His reports had shaped enemy thinking for months. He had convinced an entire intelligence network that a massive army was preparing to attack Pas-de-Calais. But now, as the invasion fleet began its journey across the Channel, the truth would become visible. If the enemy leaders doubted him now, even for a single moment, the consequences would be catastrophic. A storm rattled the windows. The lights flickered. Pujol looked down at the sheet of paper before him, the draft of his final pre-invasion message. His pulse quickened. His hands were steady, but his breath came slower than usual, deeper, heavier, as if his mind recognized the significance of each word. He wrote about seeing troop movements on the south coast. He described soldiers loading onto landing craft. He reported that something unusual was happening, but he stopped short of stating clearly that an invasion was underway. The goal was not to warn the enemy. The goal was to appear as a loyal agent who was trying to warn them while ensuring the message arrived too late.
Pujol glanced at the clock. He and his handlers calculated the perfect delay. A message sent now would be received by the German intelligence center hours later, hours too late to be useful. The invasion would already have begun. Enemy leaders would assume the Normandy attack was a feint. They would continue to hold their armored divisions at Calais. GARBO inhaled slowly and nodded to the radio operator. "Send it," he whispered. The operator began transmitting, tapping the coded message into the ether. Each click of the transmitter was a heartbeat in the dark room. MI5 officers stood perfectly still, watching, listening, waiting. When the transmission was complete, Pujol closed his eyes. For a moment, the room was silent except for the soft hum of machines. He felt the weight of the work settle on his shoulders. This message, more than any other, would define his legacy. Outside, the Channel storm began to ease. Winds calmed. The invasion fleet moved forward. Hours later, enemy interception centers received GARBO's urgent warning. Analysts read his words with serious focus. His credibility, built over years, made the message feel urgent and sincere. But the timing was poor. The commanders who needed the information were either sleeping, traveling, or unreachable. By the time the message reached the desks of the High Command, Allied forces were already landing in Normandy. The timing was perfect. The deception was complete. Even as reports from Normandy flooded in, from coastal defenses, from field officers, from radar stations, senior German commanders refused to believe it was the real invasion. GARBO had conditioned them too well. For months, he had told them that the main attack would come at Calais, that the Allies were preparing their strongest divisions for that region, that Normandy was merely a diversion. Now, confronted with reality, they chose to trust the illusion instead.
GARBO's influence reached higher than he ever imagined. Enemy high command ordered their armored divisions to hold back. Reinforcements remained stationed near Calais. The fear of a second larger invasion immobilized experienced troops who could have crushed the Allied beachheads. On the beaches of Normandy, soldiers fought through chaos, gunfire, explosions, blood, smoke, never realizing that a man sitting in a quiet London office had helped hold back the very reinforcements that could have annihilated them. GARBO did not know the full extent of his impact that morning. He sat in the MI5 office, listening to the radio, hearing scattered reports of the landings. He felt anxious, unsure, caught between relief and dread. He had done his part, but success would depend on countless other variables beyond his control. Hours passed, the invasion held, the beachheads grew, the Allies endured. MI5 received new intercepts from the enemy, revealing their interpretation of events. They believed GARBO's reports. They believed Normandy was a diversion. They believed Calais remained the true target. A wave of relief swept through British intelligence offices. Officers exhaled, some for the first time in days. They shook hands. They closed their eyes in gratitude. Some simply sat down, exhausted, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had been avoided. GARBO, however, did not celebrate. He remained seated, staring at the map of France pinned to the wall. His expression was calm, almost solemn. For all the success, he felt the weight of what the coming days would bring. Battles, casualties, destruction. Even a successful invasion was still a tragedy written in blood. But he had done what he set out to do. His lies had saved countless lives. His deception had shaped the fate of Europe. As the sun rose over the English Channel that morning, its light touched both the soldiers on the beaches and the quiet Spaniard who had helped them reach that shore.
Over the next 2 weeks, GARBO's influence only grew stronger. He informed the enemy leadership that the Normandy attack was merely the first phase of a larger operation. He claimed that once the enemy committed forces to counter the Normandy landings, the main blow would strike at Calais. His handlers in Berlin repeated these analyses to their superiors. High command absorbed them eagerly. The illusion became self-sustaining. Enemy divisions that could have crushed the early Allied lines remained frozen. Trains loaded with reinforcements stayed parked in rail yards. Commanders read GARBO's letters and concluded that the enemy was waiting for the perfect moment to strike the decisive blow. Even after a full month had passed, GARBO insisted that the main assault was still forthcoming. Enemy confidence in his analysis never wavered. They continued to monitor the imaginary army group he had described. They tracked non-existent troop movements. They analyzed radio traffic that MI5 had carefully scripted for them. Every deception held firm, a testament not just to strategic planning, but to Pujol's uncanny ability to turn fiction into something indistinguishable from truth. Behind the scenes, MI5 officers marveled at the extent of his influence. Harris once remarked that GARBO has built an empire of ghosts. Colquhoun added, quieter but more thoughtful, and Berlin kneels before them. Months after D-Day, GARBO's handlers informed him that he had been nominated for a prestigious military honor. The irony would have been comical if the stakes had not been so serious. For his loyal service, the German command granted him the Iron Cross, one of the highest military decorations of their armed forces. MI5 received the news with a mixture of disbelief and grim amusement. GARBO had succeeded beyond anything they imagined possible. They even arranged for him to receive a physical medal after the war, a symbol of a deception so perfect that the very people he undermined had rewarded him for it.
In the hours after the invasion began,
chaos erupted across the French coast. Shore batteries fired blindly through the fog. Field commanders sent frantic messages pleading for reinforcements. Tanks moved cautiously along muddy roads, unsure of which direction the real threat would emerge. The world had stepped into a storm of uncertainty, yet one man's voice in London remained the steady, unseen current shaping events across the front. GARBO continued transmitting calmly. Even as reports from Normandy intensified, he emphasized that every indication still pointed to a larger force being held back, a force preparing for Calais. This message, repeated with unwavering consistency, reassured the enemy intelligence officers that their assumptions were correct. Normandy was a feint. The real invasion was imminent. In Berlin, senior military planners clung to their original belief, not because evidence supported it, but because GARBO had nurtured it for months. They had invested trust, resources, and emotional confidence into his intelligence. To abandon it now would mean admitting they had been outmaneuvered. Confirmation bias became their invisible cage. One general, reading GARBO's post-invasion messages, reportedly insisted that enemy forces in Normandy were merely an opening gesture. Another reminded his staff that the first U.S. Army group, supposedly under General Patton, had not yet moved. They waited and waited while Allied forces strengthened their grip on the beachheads. In London, MI5 analysts watched intercepts come in with fascination. They could see the effect of GARBO's work in real time. Reports describing enemy hesitation, delayed movements, and misallocated resources painted a clear picture. The deception had succeeded beyond all expectations. GARBO's messages continued with the same emotional tone he had always used: earnest, self-sacrificing, loyal. He wrote of his exhaustion, of the sleepless nights he claimed to endure for the cause, and of how desperately he wished he could have warned his handlers earlier. His sincerity, even though entirely fabricated, deepened their belief in him. Meanwhile, Allied forces were pushing inland from Normandy, inching forward through hedgerows, villages, and fortified positions. Every hour that enemy armored divisions stayed at Calais was an hour bought with deception, an hour that saved thousands of lives.
But Pujol did not celebrate. He accepted the honor with modesty, but inside he felt a strange sadness. The medal symbolized the extent of the illusion, yes, but it also symbolized the tragedy of war itself, where lies shaped decisions and millions suffered for the beliefs of a few. As the Allies pushed further into France, liberating city after city, GARBO continued feeding false reports, maintaining the illusion until it was no longer needed. The fictional First U.S. Army Group began to disperse slowly in his messages, explained through plausible reasons: reassignments, supply constraints, strategic pauses. When the deception was finally retired, Berlin never questioned why the invasion at Calais never materialized. They simply assumed the Allies had changed their plans. Pujol grew quieter during these months. The intensity of the deception had taken a toll on him. Sleepless nights, constant focus, the moral pressure of knowing his lies could shift the fate of thousands, all weighed heavily on his spirit. He often walked alone through the quiet streets of London during the evenings, reflecting on the extraordinary path that had brought him here. The city was still dimly lit under wartime restrictions, but in the darkness he found a strange comfort. He had helped it save, not with a rifle or a uniform, but with persistence and imagination. His MI5 handlers began to sense that the war for GARBO had become deeply personal. He spoke of his childhood in Barcelona, of witnessing cruelty during the Civil War, of the helplessness he once felt. Now, deception had given him agency. a way to fight oppression in a manner uniquely his own. By the time the Allies had crossed into Belgium, Pujol's role in the war was essentially complete. His fictional network was retired. His transmissions grew infrequent. The web of lies he had woven began to dissolve. Yet even as his operational role faded, his impact continued to ripple across Europe. Commanders, historians, and intelligence officers would later confirm what Garbo already suspected. His deception saved lives. Countless lives. The invasion had been secured not just by courage, but by crafted illusions. And the man behind those illusions was not a trained spy, not a soldier, not a high-ranking official. He was a former poultry farmer with a conscience sharper than any blade and a determination that reshaped history.
When the war in Europe began collapsing, the streets of London filled with a cautious sense of hope. Newspapers printed the slow, steady progress of Allied troops as they pushed deeper into enemy territory. Radios crackled with announcements of liberated cities, broken lines, and the fall of once impenetrable fortresses. The world was shifting from darkness toward the possibility of dawn. In MI5's quiet corridors, however, there was a different atmosphere, one of closure. The deception units, once buzzing with coded messages and secret drafts, grew still. Operation Fortitude was no longer necessary. Garbo's vast network of imaginary agents had served their purpose. The ghosts he had created could finally be allowed to fade. For Juan Pujol Garcia, the end of the war brought a strange mix of relief and melancholy. His life had been defined by deception for years, a deception that demanded constant vigilance, creativity, and emotional discipline. When the transmissions stopped and the radio fell silent, he felt an emptiness, as though something vital had been removed from his very being. He found himself walking through London in quiet reflection. The city bore the scars of war: shattered windows, bombed-out shells of buildings, memorial notices pinned to doorways. And yet he sensed a resilience beneath it all, a courage reflected in the faces of ordinary people who had endured so much. Sometimes he would linger near the Thames, watching the water move calmly under the bridges, thinking of all the unseen currents that shaped history, the hidden decisions, the small acts of bravery, the lies that saved thousands. He wondered where he fit within those currents. Was he a hero, as some in MI5 suggested, or merely a man who had played a necessary role in a cruel and unforgiving world? As the war neared the conclusion, MI5 made a decision that surprised him. They recommended that Pujol receive a British honor for his service, a quiet recognition for a man who had shaped one of the most important military decisions of the century. But the award, though meaningful, came with a heavy truth. Garbo's safety could no longer be guaranteed. The German leadership, having trusted him deeply, would not appreciate discovering the scale of his betrayal. Revenge, even years after the war, was not unthinkable. Intelligence agencies around the world assured MI5 that certain individuals might attempt to track down Garbo to settle old scores. Pujol understood the risk. Betraying an empire, even through lies, was not something easily forgiven. Thus began the slow process of erasing Juan Pujol Garcia from the world. MI5 helped arrange a new identity for him. They forged documents, created a new personal history, and provided him with a destination where no one would think to search: Caracas, Venezuela. It was a place far removed from the battlefields of Europe, a world of humid nights, tall mountains, and vast forests.
Before he left London, Pujol had one last meeting with Thomas Harris. The two men, who had built the greatest deception of the war side by side, sat together in a quiet room, drinking coffee in the dim afternoon light. Harris looked at him with affection and sadness. "You know," he said softly, "history may never fully understand what you've done." Pujol smiled, weary but sincere. History doesn't need to understand. It only needs to endure. Harris nodded. There was nothing more to say. Their work, their extraordinary, impossible work, was complete. When Pujol boarded the ship for South America, he felt the strange sensation of stepping not into a new life, but into a shadow of one. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, the sea calm and reflective under the drifting clouds. He leaned against the railing, watching the water ripple and reform beneath the hull, thinking of all the identities he had worn: husband, farmer, liar, spy, savior. The ship carried him across the Atlantic, far from the country that had become his covert home. When he stepped onto Venezuelan soil, the air felt different, warmer, heavier, unfamiliar. The streets were busy with vendors, the sound of Spanish chatter filling the air. It was strangely comforting to hear his native language spoken so freely again, yet he remained alone, unknown, and unseen. Pujol opened a small business, raised a family, and lived quietly under his new name. He tended to chickens once more, just as he had before the war. The work was simple, repetitive, grounding, a way of life far removed from the labyrinth of secrets and lies he had once navigated. Years passed. He remained hidden from the world. He heard the occasional rumor of books being written about D-Day, documentaries made about intelligence operations, films produced about the war. Sometimes he wondered if anyone suspected that the man who had shaped Operation Fortitude was now selling eggs in a Venezuelan market. He never said a word. Silence became his ally.
Yet the silence also weighed on him. He watched his children grow up without knowing the truth of who their father was. He carried memories that no one around him shared. People spoke of the war casually, with half-remembered stories and distant admiration, not realizing that the man beside them had played a central role in its outcome. It wasn't until the 1970s, nearly 30 years after D-Day, that a British historian researching deception operations uncovered something unexpected. He found hints of a master double agent named GARBO, a man whose identity had been concealed, whose fate was unknown. This discovery sent ripples through the historical community. Files were reopened, records were traced, names were cross-referenced. The historian traveled across continents, following faint threads of evidence until he reached Caracas. There, in a small, modest home surrounded by chickens and fruit trees, he found an elderly man with a quiet gaze and a calm voice. When the historian introduced himself and explained his research, Pujol hesitated. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with the faintest smile, he replied, "I was waiting for someone to come." It was the first time he had spoken openly about his past in decades. The rediscovery of Garbo's true identity was met with astonishment. Newspapers published stories about him, documentaries sought to interview him, scholars debated the nature of his work. But Pujol himself remained humble. He insisted that he was merely a man who did what he felt was right in a world losing its moral compass. He traveled briefly to Europe, visiting London once more. As he walked along the Thames, older now, his steps slower, he felt a rush of memories. The nights spent drafting messages, the carefully timed transmissions, the overwhelming responsibility of deception. The city looked different, brighter, freer, but beneath its newness he sensed the echoes of the war he had once fought from within its walls. He visited Normandy, standing quietly on the beaches he had helped protect from afar. The waves washed gently over the sand, and the wind moved through the cliffs. He felt a deep stillness within himself. The cost of the invasion had been immense, yet the world built from its aftermath had endured.
When he returned to Venezuela, he carried with him a sense of closure. He had been Garbo, the man who fooled an empire, but he had also been Juan, the man who sought only to defend human dignity in the only way he could. Both identities lived within him, intertwined like threads of the same tapestry. He died in 1988, quietly, surrounded by his family. Few outside intelligence circles knew his name. Fewer still understood the magnitude of what he had done.
History is often written around great battles, heroic charges, and the thunder of artillery. But the story of Garbo reminds us that sometimes the most decisive victories happen in silence, in quiet rooms lit by dim lamps, in coded messages transmitted through static-filled radios, in lies crafted with precision and purpose. When historians speak of D-Day, they speak of bravery, sacrifice, and liberation. They speak of soldiers storming the beaches under gunfire, pilots flying through dangerous skies, and sailors navigating treacherous waters. These stories are rightfully honored. They reflect the courage that shaped the modern world. But there is another layer to this history, hidden beneath the surface, like the foundation of a building. It is the layer built by men and women who worked in shadows, shaping perceptions instead of landscapes, guiding decisions instead of bullets. Garbo was one of the finest among them, a man whose weapon was not a rifle, but a narrative. His deception bought precious hours during the invasion, hours in which beachheads solidified, reinforcements landed, and momentum grew. Hours that transformed the invasion from a desperate gamble into an unfolding victory. The lives saved by those hours can never be fully counted, but their echoes remain in every story told about that day. Reflecting on Garbo's work raises profound questions about truth and morality. Can lies ever serve justice? Can deception be an instrument of peace? On the surface, the idea feels contradictory. Yet, in the context of war, a conflict defined by destruction and cruelty, Garbo's lies became bridges to a better future.
He never glorified what he did. He never presented himself as heroic. When asked later in life how he viewed his role, he simply said, "I did what conscience asked of me." It was a quiet answer, one that spoke volumes. In a world burning with conflict, he chose to defend humanity not through violence, but through intellect. There is something deeply human about Pujol's journey. He began as an ordinary man, a man with doubts, fears, and frustrations, but he refused to stand by and watch tyranny spread unchecked. He found a way, however unconventional, to shape the world around him. His life is a reminder that bravery comes in many forms, some seen, many unseen. Today, intelligence agencies study his methods, scholars write about him, and filmmakers depict his story. Yet, for all the attention he receives now, it is important to remember that for decades he lived in silence, forgotten by the world he helped save. His anonymity was both protection and punishment. But perhaps it was also a testament to his character, a man who never sought fame, only purpose. When we stand on the shores of Normandy today, listening to the waves roll in, we hear more than the sound of the sea. We hear the echoes of stories woven into that coastline. Some are loud and heroic, others are quiet and hidden. Garbo's story is one of those quiet ones, a whisper woven into the wind.
In many ways, Garbo symbolizes the complexity of war itself. He represents the paradox that in order to preserve truth, sometimes one must master deception. That in order to protect lives, sometimes one must embrace shadows. And that in order to shape a better world, sometimes one must do the right thing in a way the world may never fully understand.
The story of Garbo invites us to reflect on the unseen threads that hold history together. It urges us to consider how many other nameless individuals, working in secrecy, driven by conscience, helped shape turning points in human destiny. It reminds us to look beyond the surface of recorded events and to seek the deeper narratives that make those events possible. As we reach the end of this documentary, one final image remains: a man standing alone on a quiet beach, watching the waves wash over the sand. He is neither soldier nor general. He carries no weapon. His footsteps leave no monument, no plaque, no medal to mark his presence. Yet in his silence, in his calm gaze, there lies a profound truth. History is written not only by those who march, but also by those who imagine. Garbo's legacy endures not because he fooled an empire, but because he used deception to serve life, not death. His lies protected the fragile dawn of liberation. His courage stood between the world and disaster. His imagination helped light the path toward freedom. As the waves continue their endless rhythm, sweeping across the sands of Normandy, they carry with them the memory of countless sacrifices, and among them, the quiet, unseen work of a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is the truth we choose to protect through the stories we tell. This is the legacy of Juan Pujol Garcia. This is the gift of Garbo, the spy who saved D-Day.